Good evening, everyone. My name is Isabelle Lorrain, and I'm Secretary of Ensemble pour protéger les enfants, which is accompanying us in the conference, saying yes at 12 years old, really? And everything which will be quoted as statistics or anything else, all the references are documented. You'll be able to come back with us. We don't have time to name everything, but everything is documented. So welcome to our vice chairman, for our presentation, Mrs. Anand Masouad, our president. And tonight, Mr. Jean-Léon Lafitte, who is vice chairman of EPPNE, who is going to give us the welcoming words. Thank you, Isabelle. First of all, I'd like to pass on the greetings from our president, Mrs. Anand, who has family obligations unexpectedly. So as many of you have children here, I think you'll understand that these are things that can happen. She'll joining us a bit later, but she sends us her regards. Then, on behalf of the whole team, I'd like to thank you for being here. If you're there, it's because you care about the fate of our children in Quebec, something that concerns us enormously, and we're ready to put all of our energy, all of our work, all of our goodwill, all our participation to protect them. So that's why we're here tonight, to give you the information and to share with you on what we can do in the current situation. I give you back the microphone. Isabelle can answer your questions later. So the presentation, following presentation, will be form of an interview between Mr. Lucas Magnus, who is a retired teacher, French retired teacher, and Madame Titine Quenze, who is a doctor in international law and mother of 3 children. And Mr. Jean-Léon, also father of 3 children, who's president of the Association of the Catholic Parents of Quebec. So Lucas, Titine, Jean-Léon, you have the floor. Thank you so much, Isabelle. Welcome to this session. I will start by my guest. Hello, Mr. Magnus. Hello, Mr. Lafitte. For those who don't know you, could you briefly introduce yourselves? Yes, of course. You've already did it a little bit. So that's me, Lucas Magnus. And I'm a retired history and French teacher, originally from Belgium. I have been living in Montreal for 10 years. And I have been a member of EPPNE board for almost a year. Thank you, Lucas. My name is Jean-Léon. That's my main title, father of 3 children. It's the reason why I'm here. It's the reason why I get involved in the Association of Catholic Parents of Quebec and with the organization Ensemble pour protéger les enfants. So, Lucas, I will start with you. I think we can call us on use first names. We know that you have already given a presentation on the dangers of teaching gender ideology in our Quebec schools a few weeks ago already, and we can watch it on our website. Why this second topic that EPPNE is presenting to us today? Well, as EPPNE, we'd like to explore another aspect that concerns us about the education of our children in our schools. We are worried about the desire to sexualize our children in our schools, and we would like to explain in this context the way in which it is done to achieve this goal of sexualizing our children. In the context of sexualization of our children, the method used to achieve this sexualization is the principle of consent, which in fact makes our young people vulnerable to sexual abuse. We will explain it during this conference. And to understand well this title, saying yes at 12 years old, really. Why is this theme so important? Well, as I said, we must protect absolutely our children from sexual abuse of any kind. To do this, we must be consistent and adhere to the following rule. An adult must never engage in sexual relations with a minor or on a sexual level. This prohibition includes any adult sexual language that a child cannot understand. Sexual language and sexual acts have no place in schools or anywhere else. This is a transgression as old as time, which says that we cannot betray the innocence of a child or a young person who is still developing. However, if society is shocked by abuse, and we are, we will have to take into consideration this prohibition. Otherwise, it is not taking the necessary steps to prevent it. By speaking of adult sexual language to children, especially in our schools, they are being sexualized against their will, because children do not naturally seek sexual relations. They only need tenderness, affection, love, and instruction. And the task of the school is to give instruction. By drawing them into a sexual realm that is foreign to them, we are perverting children and indirectly promoting sexual abuse. Here is a short video clip from the program with Sophie Durocher about what is happening in our classrooms in Quebec. A small video will be followed by an explanation by Christelle Comet, Vice President of the French Association Maman Louvre. In this interview, Christelle Comet explains that using adult sexual language with our children at school is inappropriate and can have serious consequences. We were told, for example, about a book called The Rooster Who Wanted to Be a Hen. The second book is really, the first is a fable, but the second is called Sex, That Funny Word, and it's a book that is supposedly for children aged 8 to 12. And it's a book of sex education. Yes, 68, yes. We have a little boy who has an erection in bed, okay, we know that. And we have a little girl who is happily masturbating under a tree in what appears to be a park. In reality, the only thing that should be explained to children is very simple. Your body is your body. No one should touch it. You don't have sexuality. That's what we must teach children. And in fact, any parent, any teacher is able to say this in words that children can understand. On the other hand, when it comes to sex education for children, I think parents need to ask themselves about the legitimacy of this education. And I would like to take this opportunity to give a brief overview of what is happening abroad on the European level. There are many countries that have rejected this education, that have mobilized and said, no, we will not educate children about sexuality. We will not educate them about sexualization. Preserving children's innocence is precisely what we are talking about here, something that is not only sacred, but also necessary for the development of children into well-adjusted adults tomorrow. Certainly not exposing children to sexuality that will help them in the present or in their future. Thank you for this video. I'm still thinking about it. Before continuing, I wanted to ask you the following question. There's a lot of talk in the media about gender ideology, and I'd like to know if there's a connection between gender ideology and today's subject. Yes, there is a link. There is a link. While it's true that gender ideology, which we discussed in our presentation a few weeks ago, is an important element and harmful element in sex education in our schools, it's not the only ideology that harms our children. In reality, in our children's sex education, the teaching of gender ideology is accompanied by another ideology, which is less discussed. but which is as dangerous as the first, if not even more dangerous. This is the ideology of infantile sexualization. What is this ideology of infantile sexualization? What is its danger? The theory of infantile sexualization asserts that children have an active sexuality from birth, and therefore the theory develops the following reasoning. A child having an active sexuality would have the capacity to consent, to say yes or no to an adult's invitation to a sexual act. But even crazier, this theory also assumes that this child also has the psychological maturity to say yes or no to an adult. However, a child, as we know, is not an adult. And by their very nature as a child, they recognize the superiority of the adult. They know that the adult is superior and in intelligence and in maturity. That is why they trust them completely. This shows that a child is necessarily an easy victim when faced with an adult abuser. Thank you, Lucas. To clarify this important question of sexualization of children, what is the link between ideology of infantile sexualization and gender ideology? Yes, it's good that you asked me the question again. In fact, the link is like this. Both ideologies give a responsibility to children that they are incapable of assuming. In the case of gender ideology, children are asked to self-determine when they don't yet have the psychological capacity to do so. And in the case of the ideology of infantile sexualization, children are made responsible for consenting or not to a sexual act, the scope of which they don't yet know, since they don't have a sexual life and are psychologically immature to do so. Okay. So I understand the fact that both ideologies, gender and infantile sexualization, have converged in our school and that they reinforce each other. But can you tell us how this theory of infantile sexualization came about? Yes, it's important to understand the origin. I will explain the origins of this ideology, and we'll see that from the very beginning, this theory had ideological characteristics, particularly because it was based on methods that turned out to be unscientific and immoral. The theory was developed by an American scientist, biologist, and sexologist, Alfred Kinsey, who published these theories in his most famous book with the title Sexual Behavior in Men, published in 1948. And it's interesting to know that John Money, the author of gender theory, published his book in which he explains his gender theory only a few years later. So therefore, John Money knew the Kinsey's theory in a certain way. He developed it. So to return to Kinsey, with his first book, he revolutionized thinking about sexuality at that time by claiming that children were sexually active from birth and that one could therefore establish a sexual relationship with them. It's important to know that Kinsey was a self-proclaimed active pedophile. That's not us who say it, he said it himself. It's clear that this theory would justify his behavior and outlook. Here's a video now that is introducing this controversial figure. On the other hand, we can find origins that are much older, namely the work of a pedophile, a pedocriminal, Alfred Kinsey, and his followers, who developed an entire ideology based on vague concepts and completely bogus research practices in which they attempted to demonstrate that babies are born sexual beings, notably by conducting utterly despicable experiments in which pedophiles stimulated small babies measuring orgasms that were in fact seizures imposed on these little babies. Alfred Kinsey brought sexology into the modern era. Through large-scale scientific studies, he used his academic prestige to make statements that were surprising for the time. The frequency of masturbation, extramarital affairs, and homosexuality. At war with sexual repression, Kinsey was hugely successful among his contemporaries, who used his work to fight against sexual hypocrisy. The dark side of Kinsey's work was long hidden. Biased or even falsified samples, sexual offenders recruited as guinea pigs in prisons, and above all, the recruitment of pedophiles to conduct experiments on childhood sexuality directly on their children. To assert that babies are sexual beings, Kinsey asked fathers to masturbate their babies and record their physiological stress reactions as scientific proof of orgasms. This was organized rapes of babies for the purposes of pedophile propaganda. Kinsey was a seriously disturbed individual who practiced sexual mutilations on himself. As a young man, Kinsey began inserting objects into his urethra, including straws, pipe cleaners, pencils, and then toothbrushes, to punish himself for his homosexual urges. These practices continued throughout his life to the point where he circumcised himself without anesthesia. Kinsey said young children need, and I quote, it's a quote, young children need explicit sex education as early as possible since they are sexual from birth. As early as possible. This is what we're being sold for sex education starting in early grades in France. Programs promoted by the United Nations to make sex education as explicit as possible from the early grades. Kinsey sold it to us in the 1950s. And he also said that children can benefit from sexual relations with adults, including their parents. Thank you. Thank you. We hope that scientists have not all followed this theory of Kinsey. Yes, thankfully, not all have followed the Kinsey. Some have, but fortunately, many child psychiatrists disagree with this theory. They base on their work, among other things, we have to call this theory of this latency period from Freud. This latency period was developed by Sigmund Freud and refers to a specific phase of the child's psychosexual development, which generally occurs between the age of 6 and the onset of puberty around 11 to 12 years old. According to Freud, the latency period is a phase during which sexual urges and concerns related to sexuality become latent in the child. That is, this means less active. Freud considered it a period of relative psychosexual stability on a psychosexual level, masked by a diminished reduction of erotic desires and a reorientation of psychic energy, which he calls libido, towards other spheres, such as learning, social relationships, and connective development. This latency theory is one of the reasons why many child psychiatrists believe that children should not be sexualized. What about programs, sex education programs in our schools in Quebec? Yes, we have studied well these programs, and here are some excerpts from the Ministry of Education's program for sex education courses taught. I will read a few sentences that demonstrate the extent to which the sexualization of children is being pursued. So, Titine, can I ask you to read the titles of the program? Let's start with primary school for children aged 6 to 8. So illustrated by concrete examples, how is sexual experience and expressed in a child's life? So for children aged 10 to 12, develop a better self-knowledge and expressing your sexuality as a child. Develop a capacity to recognize sexual aggression, know how and when to use preventive and self-protection skills. Yes, let's stop for one moment on this phrase. We see that we are teaching young children how to protect themselves against adult sexual abuse. This seems positive, but the question is, how are we going to do this? The goal may seem laudable, that is, that we want to teach young children how to protect themselves. Unfortunately, the method they're trying to use is inappropriate. Effectively, is it responsible to explain adult sexuality to children who have no sexuality and therefore can't even understand it? The fact is that when a child encounters an adult abuser, the child, knowing that the adult is superior to him or her, has authority over him or her, the child will trust the adult, and therefore, what the child will remember from what he learned at school is that as adult sexuality will seem familiar to them and will not prevent them from trusting the abuser. In addition, we can ask ourselves whether talking about adult sexuality can not shock or even traumatize young people. As we see in examples later in this presentation, we will show you examples. So instead of protecting them, we risk disrupting their age-appropriate psychological development. Regarding the term of self-protection, we can ask ourselves whether it is reasonable to make children responsible for their protection against abuse by adults. Wouldn't it be the role of adults to protect children and prevent them from being abused? Wouldn't it be much more useful to train teachers and other stakeholders by equipping them with techniques to spot the signs of children who are victims of abuse? Nothing, or far too little, is done for this here in Quebec. We are content to give them the responsibility, to children to protect themselves on their own. Yes, giving this responsibility to children from young age is borderline scandalous. And at the secondary level, what is taught? Well, in second year of secondary school, for adolescents aged 13 to 14, we read myths about precocious sexual activity. Yes, this sentence, with this sentence, existence of myth on precocity of sexual activity, let's understand this well. With this sentence, we can explain that, for example, parents who advocate that children are not yet mature and prepared for sexual action because they're too small, that these people have fallen behind and still believe in myths. In this section of the program, they want to convince children that this myth must be destroyed and that at their age they can indeed act sexually. The program of the text continues by mentioning the following word: self-knowledge, masturbation, caresses, kisses, hugs. Wow. And we continue in ninth grade for teens aged 14 to 15. We read of, among other things, sexual response, desire, arousal, orgasm, commitment to love or non-committal relationship, casual relationship, friendship with benefits, one-night stands, planned or unplanned, protected or unprotected consent. If I understand correctly, in the sex education program, we're clearly following Kinsey's lines, which promoted infantile sexualization and consequently proposed preparing children for what we would call a sexual career, right? Yes, that's correct. And it's really worrying. Lucas, can you give us more concrete examples of the content of these lessons? Yes, here's a short video of Jean-Léon, who's with us today. We just saw him earlier, showing what was taught to his 13-year-old son. My son is in 8th grade, he's 13 years old. He started receiving a new sex education course at school. He was taught that he could now sleep with 15-year-old girls. He could form a couple with 3, 4, 5, 6 people, contrary to the definition of the word couple. We was told that there could even be more than that, up to 30 people, and that in the case, it would be called a community that lives together and have sex together. In the past, we would have called that swinging or an orgy. They were told that in this community or couple, the word commitment is erased. It doesn't matter. Instead, we talk about participation. During the class, some children left the classroom. We went to get them in the school to bring them back. Some covered their ears, closed their eyes, looked at their feet, tried to read something else. A second teacher in the classroom in the back brought them back to order. My child will not attend this class until I know exactly the content of what the teacher is teaching. And I don't want to hear any nonsense like this taught to my child anymore. So Jean-Léon, I have children myself. And what happened to your son worries me a lot. I'm glad that you can tell us a little more about what happened to your son. What happened to your son. It's almost unbelievable that his teacher taught him that he could now, from the age of 13, have sexual relations with girls or boys of 15, and that it was possible for him to form a couple of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and up to 30 people, in which case the term couple was changed to use the term community instead, that the teacher took care to erase the term commitment in the couple, to replace it with the term participation. Finally, the teacher established a separation between the heart and the body, speaking of having sexual relations without commitment, without love. I'm surprised. I'm really surprised that all of this has been being taught to our children. And I believe that many parents are not aware of what is taught to their children from a very young age. It seems to me that this teaching prepares our children from a young age to have an active sexuality, which seems to me strange. It seems to me that it becomes more explicit for prepubescent students and then becomes very explicit for students 12, 13. So, Jean-Léon, I was wondering, what did you do after what happened to your son? Yes, right away I asked to speak to the responsible of secondary 2, the director of the school. I asked if they knew what was being taught in the school, of what was being, they were not aware. So I asked them the question, you don't know what this teacher of sexual education teaches in class? The formatted answer, the standard answer was heard as they teach the program of the government. Very good. Tell me in the program of the government where what was taught has been taught. They couldn't show me. I had the chance. So my son inspires, no, my friend, my good angel inspired me to bring a witness. It was very important because the first thing I was told, you're the only one in this situation, and very quickly I understood that you were looking for a way to silence me, but I was with a witness who was with me. So we discussed, and I told them that I wanted to have the content, the exact content of the school, not the program as being shown on the internet, but I wanted to have the agenda of the class when the class would be taught. In both cases, I was refused. So I told them, so long as I don't know what the teacher is teaching exactly to my child will not go anymore in this class. You will not teach blindly those kind of things like this. You don't even know what the teacher is teaching. And I have to say that if a stranger comes to speak about sexuality to my child, it's out of the question. Since that time, I take take out my child of this class, the principal class of sex education called Culture and Citoyenneté. And I come and get him. He stays with me in the car while we go and do a different activity. I bring him back after a period. I did that the whole year. And but at the end of this first meeting, I was simply told, if you take your child out of the school, we will start procedures and we will see you next week. So we left me on that note. So that was very important. This following week, I came back, but this time with my lawyer, and I started right away with this. So my lawyer started by saying, what are the threats you told to my clients? What do you talk about procedures you will start? And then the first reaction they had was to say, it's not true. We never said that. Thankfully, I had a witness with me who corroborated what I said, and they retracted themselves. That's what. So they were afraid at that time. They could see that the procedure intimidation didn't work, because my lawyer said we were ready to take any procedures. If you want to send the Child Protective Services, the DPJ, go ahead. So it ended like this. They didn't do anything more. Since that time, my child, I take him out of the class. He doesn't follow that class. And what happened, and I'm very happy about this, and because I wanted to do it as well, is my child will be expelled from the college where he's attending now, but I found a better school for him. And I want to say this because it's important to say it. The teachers nominated my child, every class, every teacher. He received a gold medal, the best medal as a student, and they're kicking him out of the school. It's very ironic. That's it. What's important for me is to show, to remain firm, polite, but to be conscious. We can talk about it later, that authority is not them who have it, it's us. They cannot do anything. We act appropriately. We can take away our children from the class. They cannot prevent us from doing so. If they don't want to cooperate, we are the first educator. It's known and by all international charters. As we are conscious, we act appropriately. I hope I answered well your question. Thank you. Thank you so much. It gives me hope, but at the same time, it gives me the creeps when I listen to this situation. So now, Lucas, what is your reaction to what is happening to schools and the difficulties parents face in making their voices heard? Yes, as very well explained by Jean-Léon, it's very worrying. We must become aware that of this situation together for all of us here, all the parents. But it's clear that in our Western world, following Kinsey's studies, the phenomenon of sexualization of children, which can be defined as the process by which children are assigned characteristics or roles with sexual connotations, that this culture has developed considerably and infiltrated international bodies such as the United Nations and its agency, the World Health Organization. These organizations have clearly referred since 1989 in their standards, which are recommendations to their 193 members, and almost the whole world, actually. They're almost all members. They clearly speak in those standards of children's sexual rights, which are an integral part of human rights. Although it's true, it's very serious. Although it's true that these are not true guidelines, but recommendations, governments and ministries of education of member states tend to follow these recommendations at the global level. And this is the situation we find ourselves in Quebec and many other Western countries. It's clear that this view of things facilitates the connection with pornographic and pedophile networks. I'd like to ask another question to Jean-Léon. Has there been other attempts by children to prevent what's happening in our school? Actually, many parents take similar steps to protect their children. And I can say, for having talked to many of them, that they were all told the same thing, that you are the only parent that is disturbed by that class. There's always an attempt to isolate the parent, to make him think that he's the only alone and being scandalized by this course. Everyone else find it normal. But many parents are removing their children from the class, take steps with the administration, but always we try to isolate themselves, make them think they're alone. Thank you, Jean-Léon, for these explanations. I have another question for Lucas. Can we learn from what's happening in other countries? Yes. We will show you a video with two experts from France who explain how the sexualization of children violates their psychological development. In the first interview, clinical and therapist Marie-Estelle Dupont, author of several books with extensive experience working with child and adolescent trauma, describes the danger of sexualization children in schools, which ignores the child's psychological development. In the second interview, Sophie Auduger, former delegate of the French Association SOS Education, and also author of several books, explains what child psychiatrists call psychological rape. Both experts believe that sex education itself should be entrusted to parents and that schools should take care of instruction, leaving actual education to the parents. Emotional and cognitive development follows physiological development until puberty. Prepubescent children are physiologically immature for adult sexuality. Similarly, they are emotionally and cognitively immature for adult sexuality. They gradually explore their bodies as an expression of their senses. And the problem today is that we live in a society that denies gender differences, generational differences, the position of adults, the biological differences, so the especially difference between inside and outside, meaning that we'll teach at school about the right to privacy, which is already a paradoxical injunction. The position of the adult, whether it be the parent or any figure who has authority over the child, is first and foremost a role of excitement barrier. So our role as adults is to ensure that future adults are able to channel their impulses. Would it ever occur to you, Andre, if I entrusted with you a 9-month-old baby for a few hours to give him meat that has not been pureed? No, because he does not have teeth. In other words, our role is to present reality to our children as they are able to assimilate it. What does psychological rape mean? And it is a term that is used by a number of child psychiatrists to explain the traumatic impact that can have on certain children, forcing them to engage in sexual, when you force a child to get involved in sexuality at an age where they're completely incapable of understanding such information. Maurice Berger explains very well the traumatic mechanisms, that is, when you force a child to address a topic that they have never thought about before. So you are breaking into their psyche. You're forcing them to address a subject that they either refuse to talk about because they have no desire to talk about it or engage with it at that moment, or because their imagination, what we call his fantasy world, will be forced to imagine things that are not able to process at that time. In fact, children, if you want, go through a well-known developmental process, which is well-known. This developmental process means that between the ages of 3, 4, and up to 7, child form their own ideas about their origin, which we call their fantasy vision. And these ideas take root in the world of childhood, which is the world of imagination. These are their own constructions, and these constructions are very important for children to build themselves for two major reasons. There are many others, of course, I'm simplifying to the extreme. The first reason is that children between the age of 3 and 7 will deal with anxieties related to developing outside of the family union. So they are worried about entering the outside world. So they will need to reassure themselves, and they need to do so by creating their own vision of the world and forming relationships outside the home, particularly at school. And then there are the ideas on the origin of life, that is, how they think about the arrival in the world and their parents' relationship. For the child, his father and mother are lovers unlike any others, and he will construct his own idea. And the fact of coming up against these ideas, these thoughts, will force a child to enter a reality, into a reality that he is not able to process cognitively or even accept himself in order to look at the world around him. And that, if you like, is what we effectively call causing a breach in the child's psyche, hence the term psychological rape. Thank you for this two videos. So, Lucas, we hear a lot about the principle of consent, which is taught in schools. We heard a lot about sexologists in the school, of the teaching of this sexual ideologies. What is about the principle of consent taught in the school? In Quebec school, in sex education program, the concept of consent is addressed starting in the third cycle of primary school and continuing into high school. We speak more so about this in the first year of secondary school, age 11, 12. What does consent mean in the sexual sphere? The principle of consent is simple. This concept says that to have a sexual relationship, both parties must consent. That is, they agree to the sexual intercourse that will take place. But at the same time, this concept is complex because how do we understand consent? Is it through words, or is consent expressed through a gesture, an attitude? Is a smile enough to consent? In relationships based on affection, particularly when it's about relationship with minors, everything can be easily misinterpreted. Okay, I understand now that in practice, giving consent is not that simple. But can you explain more about the dangers of this principle, teaching this principle? Yes. The problem with teaching the concept of consent lies in the fact that this concept can be misinterpreted. On one hand, it is clear that talking about consent to children can be useful and even necessary to warn the child or teenager against any attempt at touching him or sexual acts by other people. In short, the child must be warned against any attempt at pedophilia. The child or adolescent must understand the total prohibition of any adult intrusion at the sexual level in his or her life. In fact, instead of the principle of consent, we should teach a principle of non-consent. But this is not what is taught in schools, because there we are talking about consent in the sense that the child could decide whether or not to consent to an attempt at abuse. It's crazy. With this concept, we're putting children in great danger. And instead of protecting them against abuse, we will, which would be the goal, of course, of the principle of consent, we will encourage actually the possibility of sexual abuse, since it leads students to think that if there is consent on both sides, See, if he consents, then anything goes. This is where the concept becomes very dangerous for the young person because they can easily fall into the trap of bad intentions on part of an adult pedophile. Let me explain. Given that the child does not yet have an active sexual life and that the teenager is still in full physical, psychological, emotional development in relation to his sexuality, the young person faced with an adult pedophile, whether a member of his family or otherwise, is in position of granting almost total trust in what an adult quote unquote friend or in a position of authority suggests. The minor, faced with an invitation from an adult to engage in sexual act, not yet having an active sexuality, is ignorant of what is going to happen. He is unaware of the real intentions of his aggressor and the negative consequences that he may suffer. It is well known that pedophile predators, in order to achieve their goals, first tame children and teenagers by gaining their trust through empathy and perverted kindness. The tragedy of all this is that the young person in their innocence lacks the capacity to realize the abuser's perverse intentions and therefore has no opportunity to oppose them. In reality, the young person is completely surrendered to their abuser, even if they have given their so-called consent. The tragedy that they will realize much later, much too late, the harmful and traumatic consequences of what they will have to endure for the rest of their lives. Here is what Christelle Comet, Vice President of Maman Louvre in France. We have come up with this crazy idea that by teaching classes, we are teaching children about sex rather than enabling them to fight against sexual and gender-based violence, because that is basically what it's all about. It's important to note that all of this is part of a health program developed by the World Health Organization. So we're talking about something global. We have European standards that say that this is what needs to be applied in terms of sexual health, and we are developing comprehensive sexuality education on the pretext that in order for tomorrow's citizens to be good citizens who will not be confronted with possible sexual and sexist violence, we are going to give them the keys. But what keys? Because children do not have sexual rights. Children are not yet sexually active. They're not psychologically equipped for it. It seems crazy to have to justify this. Children do not have sexuality. However, we will be told that children still need to be protected. Are we going to protect them by giving them access to adult sexuality and explaining them that what is fellatio and sodomy about? Is this useful? Because it's important. These are our children. Once you break them, there's no going back. There are traumatic consequences. Do we need to expose children to adult sexuality in order to protect them from sexual violence? Children are born with legs, but they don't know how to walk as soon as they leave their mother's womb. And the same is true for sexuality. Children are born with genitals, but they don't have the same function as when we are adults. And what we're saying is that, as you said earlier, that they are increasingly exposed to pornography and pedophiles outside the home, explaining that adult sexuality to them will not protect them. On the contrary, we are trivializing, normalizing adult sexuality when they are not yet capable of understanding it. So if we explain to a child that they can do these kind of things, we'll have to explain them tomorrow when if they're confronted with a pedophile. How can they tell when their teacher or nurse has told them that they can't practice sodomy, that they can practice this or that? How can they tell that the adult in front of them, what's more, the pedophiles are not all people dressed up in black coats, as we might imagine. Pedophiles establish a climate of trust with children. They make
arriver à
them
la
feel
scène d'acquis
comfortable in
avec
their
leur
childlike
environnement d'enfant.
environment.
Donc, comment on
So
va les
how
aider
are we going to help them
clairement
clearly
à
fight
lutter
against
contre
these
ces gens, à leur
people?
expliquer ce qu'est
Explain
le
what
consentement.
consent
Il n'y a
is.
pas de
There is no
consentement chez
consent in
l'enfant. Il
children.
n'y a pas
There's
de
no
droit
sexual
sexuel chez
rights in
l'enfant. Il n'y a
children.
pas de
There's no
sexualité.
sexuality.
C'est ça qu'il faut
That's what
dire aux
we need
parents.
to tell
Cette
parents.
vidéo nous fait bien
Wow, this
comprendre le danger
video
pour nos
makes us
enfants vis-à-vis d'un
understand the
adulte
danger of our
prédateur.
children faced with an adult
Mais si
predator.
j'ai bien compris, le
But if I
consentement
understand
joue
correctly,
aussi dans les
consent plays
rapports
also
entre
in the
adolescents,
relation
n'est-ce
between
pas?
teenagers,
Jean-Léon,
adolescents,
nous avons
isn't it?
regardé
Jean-Léon, we watch
avec
with
ce
amazement what your
tuteur ce
son's
que
teacher has
l'enseignant de
taught
votre
about
fils
sexual relations.
enseignait par rapport aux rapports sexuels.
So what can you
Que
tell us
pouvez-vous
about the
dire
dangers
encore
of
sur le danger du
consent?
consentement?
So before answering the question of the danger of consent, I would like to come back on the story of my son because, and what was said, that is exactly what happened. When my son told me what was said in class, my son said, "Dad, I'm shocked. I'm under, in the sense of being shaken. I never imagined the stories of couples with 6 people, nor had he imagined a community of sexual life with 30 people, which corresponds to the number of students in his class, actually. So I started to talk to him at that time and told him exactly the opposite of what the teacher said, how important and beautiful it is to not separate your heart from your body, that it's a gift of himself he is making, and that's why you have to prepare for this gift and take full measure of it. And for that, he is not ready at his age to experience that. I explained the sexual relationship as 2 sheets of paper sticking to one another with a very strong glue. That's what makes a sexual relationship. It will bond you, and it's good that it does that. Contrary to what the teacher said, it's very bad if you're separated from your heart, that your body is separated from your heart, and that you live multiple sexual experiences. We know young people today have what they call fuck friends, or simply friends for sexual activities. And these young people live such a thing like this, live very well as singles because they've lost the capacity to love and wonder about sexual life and the beauty of sexuality. So we have broken something in them that is a wonderful gift and a wonderful experience that they could live as a couple and to build together. We have instead oriented them towards what I have heard sex educators call this as a sexual career. So that is not what we as parents dream for our children, and that is not what they dream either as in their childhood. They want to start a family. So that's what I wanted to prepare him instead to counter this approach a little and tell him, no, we are going to prepare you to live a real gift of yourself and a commitment which will really protect you and protect the other. That's exactly what we cannot have love without responsibility. Then at that age, they can't be responsible. They don't really know everything about life. They can't take care of the other. So they're not ready to have a sexual life like what we would like them think that they can experience. That's what it is. Regarding consent, we can say that the principle of consent trivializes the sexual act and presenting sexual relationships simply under angle of pleasure without considering the aspect of a conscious act, which involves responsibility for oneself and for the other. This is truly irresponsible. When the young person is discovering his or her personality, he's not at that level yet. That's what is being experienced. It's something that's very damageable for him. I don't know how else to say it. So it's really what it is. We want him to take time to mature, to become a responsible adult. And at that moment, he can have a real relationship with a person where there will be love and responsibility. And it's not only consent, because we can consent for ourselves things that are wrong. Whether it's one or the other, they're not aware of what's happening, is always losers. So that's my opinion regarding consent at that age. Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Léon. Lucas, how can we guide our children as we live in a world where there are influence from all sides in the school and outside the world. So their influence, how can we guide them? Yes, as we said, it's clear that parental support for teenagers in their sexual development is of paramount importance during this delicate period of adolescence. Concerning consent, I would simply say this, and I will repeat what Jean-Léon said, which is the overall position of EPPNE, by presenting the principle of consent. Instead of protecting our children, we will have at school reduced their protection. They will go through many experiences and they will suffer a lot because the experiences with sexuality will leave traces and deep wounds. So we will reduce his protection and increase his suffering. There, that's what I can say.
Merci beaucoup.
So thank you,
Lucas,
Lucas, for these clarifications. And we are coming to the end of this presentation. A big thank you also to Jean-Léon. So before we conclude, I would like to watch one last video edited by Mrs. Danielle Balthazar, Marie-Danielle Balthazar, whom we sincerely thank for creating this montage. In this montage, Sophie Duget answers the question posed in the title of this presentation, saying yes at 12, really? This final video will also help us in understanding the responsibility that adults, all of us, and especially parents, have to protect our children. Thank you very much for your interest and for this common cause. So enjoy watching this final 4-minute video. We will continue afterwards with a period of question and answer. Thank you. We are very clear on this point, and I would like to come back to the question about consent, namely that we believe that children do not have to give consent. Children cannot say yes because, in fact, it is automatically no. Children do not have sexuality, so there can be no notion of consent. Absolutely. We believe that the myth of consent puts children at risk, and on the contrary, we must teach children that it is important for them to understand that their bodies belong to them, that no one has the right to touch it, and that no one can ask them to touch them, and that they do not have to consent because they are immature children who are small, vulnerable, unable to protect themselves. It is up to adults to protect them and ensure that children are not put in these situations, and to warn children that there are trustworthy, serious people who will protect them immediately if they are ever in danger. So we are very clear on the fact that it is important to educate children to have a whole institutional framework of adults trained to identify the signs that might suggest that a child is a victim of sexual abuse, and to have a whole human and competent organization to take care of them, support them in revealing what has happened and protect them immediately. That has not been done. There's no need to talk about adult sexuality. No scientific study proves this. That's why it's important to have work with doctors. No study proves that we need to talk about adult sexuality or use sexual language and terminology to encourage children to disclose abuse. In other words, there is absolutely no need to use scientific words for sex in order for children to disclose. And it is dishonest to think that sex education will enable children to protect themselves, since they are children, therefore vulnerable, even very vulnerable, and will never be able to protect themselves from an adult who has an power over them, particularly emotional power in the context. So it is really up to us adults in society to organize ourselves to make it possible to protect children at all levels, and certainly not ask them to protect them on their own. That they can have that it will have a lot of difficulty to overcome. And you estimate that this course of sexual education, it consists of telling them, children, we give you the elements to protect yourself. From the moment that we say that we're providing sex education classes because it will enable children to protect themselves, even to reveal abuse, and you say, no, that's not true. And I would say that perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, we had not studied this phenomena as much, but today we know very clearly how it works. It's documented how the abuser will abuse young children, how they will manipulate them emotionally. We know this very well. Unfortunately, we have many young adults who have been abused and who have had the courage to testify, to explain what they have been through, to explain why they didn't speak up, to explain that it is impossible to speak up, to explain that the shock meant that sometimes they only remembered when they were adults. So if you like, we know that it is society's responsibility to protect children and that today's society is failing to do so.